You're listening to 87.1 Caroline Radio. Hey, everybody, this is Aaron Richmond, the host of Aaron's Opinion, the podcast for blind people where we talk about issues in the blindness community. Aaron's Opinion can be heard almost anywhere you get a podcast, from Apple to Spreaker, Spotify, you name it, we're probably there. Also, you can join us on YouTube. Also, follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and even Patreon. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good week, or whenever you're listening to it. Hoping your day's going okay. I'm hanging in there. Today we have an interesting guest, someone who I came across in one of our groups on Facebook. His name is Dominic Norton, and he would like to speak to us. Probably, I'm suspicious that we're going to probably end up diving pretty deeply into some pretty fascinating topics. This is going to get good. Dominic, why don't you tell our blind listeners about being an ethical hacker and about your experience at hackathons? Go for it.
So to give you a little bit about my background, I was born and raised in London. I grew up a basketball player. I grew up an athlete, a high-level athlete, and I got recruited to play in college in America. I ended up going to a school called Tuskegee University in Alabama. And whilst at Tuskegee, I was an architecture student. I loved design, and especially growing up in London, you see lots of fancy buildings, and I thought I wanted to be an architect until, like most people, you get to university and you realize it's that topic that you thought you wanted to do your whole life, you don't want to do. And I ended up graduating in construction science management and working in St. Louis as an engineer. But my role as an engineer was very specific. I was working with emerging technology. And when you're working with emerging technology, you tend to immerse yourself in communities that are working with emerging technology. And this is where I came across events called hackathons. So hackathons are not breaking into someone's computer and trying to steal their information. They're about solving problems. So there might be a problem in the blind and visually impaired community, and people will come together, they will come up with ideas to solve it. Typically, at the hackathons I go to, you use technology, but that's not a prerequisite to hackathons. And in addition to hackathons, you have other events called datathons, which focus on data. So maybe there's, especially now with the coronavirus, there's a lot of data out there, and people may come together to make sense of it or visualize it in a particular way. Or there's mapathons, and people will come together and they will come up with creative ways to map a city or a town or a village. So what my podcasts focus on and where my special interest is bringing people together to come up with the best solutions and to solve problems. And this is what leads me to the blind and visually impaired community, especially the events I go to. I don't see many blind and visually impaired people, and this greatly hinders the solutions that we end up coming up with, because we don't have a diverse pool of people, we don't have the best people, and we don't have a range of ideas from all different types of communities.
And that is concerning and surprising. I would think that blind people would be much more active in this community.
I would think so too, but I think
that's really weird. That's weird. I thought this was a topic that blind people were immensely interested in my audience and probably in society. Well, for one thing, I'm going to start out by see one of the things I do, by the way, at Aaron's Opinion, is I have one. I never make promises I can't keep, but I do have one promise I can, and it's this. I'm going to make sure that I help you by putting the link to your podcast in the description of this video, and making sure that other people know, what your podcast is called and how they could reach out to you if they're interested, because I am suspicious that there are many, many, many blind people who would be very interested in your knowledge and would want to network with you. And I think that and I'm gonna get some nasty comments for saying this, but I think that a lot of blind people maybe are feeling a bit isolated right now and are kind of not really feeling their best emotionally. So I think that's affecting their willingness to participate in some of these events. So we really need to try to reach out to some of these people through podcasting and say, hey, get involved. This is a really important thing. So off the top of your head, what are 3 problems that you want to solve that would benefit the blindness community?
A mutual understanding. I don't know what it's like to be blind or visually impaired.
Okay.
And for me as a leader, me as a facilitator of teams, and the organizers that I tend to interview, they don't know how to best facilitate the blind community. If you have a blind person, and typically at these events, the teams are relatively small. It's a team of 5 people, but you might have maybe 10 teams there or 15 teams there. It's not a super competitive thing, even though there are prizes. It's more for fun and problem solving. But there are groups of teams. How do you facilitate events with blind people? How do you teach
Sure.
others that are not used to interacting with the blind and visually impaired community,
Right. Excellent.
and integrating them into a team dynamic?
Sure. So what it all boils down to, Dominic, is you obviously are open, right? You're open to it, or else you wouldn't be talking to me, guys. I mean, for you, Dominic, for both of us, we're just strangers. I don't actually. I basically a couple hours ago, I didn't really know why I wanted to talk to you. To be overly blunt and overly direct, which, by the way, I am. I am a pretty blunt guy. I really had no idea who you were. All I knew was that you said enough to get my attention a few days ago, and I knew something about podcasts, so I thought, oh, I'll get him into a podcast and see what happens. But I'm so glad I did, because this is exactly the type of guest that I need on my show, and this is exactly the type of content that other blind people need to be listening to. The fact is, you reach out like this, like talking to me. You say, hey, here's what I do. And then you basically say, here's what I need you to do. If you are speaking to the blind person, here's what I need you to do, and then they would do it. I really think that what's happening is that right now with the health situation, I think more and more blind people are at home than ever before, and I think that not enough of them are out and interacting with you or with other people in this community. Have you posted about your concern that there are not enough visually impaired people, blind people in these groups and meetings? Have you posted about this in or on hackathon groups on Facebook? Have you talked about it?
I've spoken more directly to organizers.
See,
And before
because
it,
I would find, I mean, the reason I'm asking that question is I would find it very hard to believe that in a hackathon group on Facebook, there's not one other blind person in the group. I would think that's just weird. If you have a group of hundreds of people, if not thousands, some of these groups, one of them has to be blind. So yeah, you've spoken to organizers, and yeah.
I've spoken to organizers directly, and I typically don't advise them anything unless they really ask. And when I advise them, I usually highlight maybe gaps or stuff other people are doing that they can add to what they're doing.
Right.
But speaking to organizers about how do they facilitate different groups, like I previously mentioned, adults with ADHD. I'm speaking to over here in the UK a charity that deal with autistic adults, and how do we integrate all these different groups? Because together we can come up with the best solutions. And especially I see in the blind and visually impaired support group, I see lots of people posting about apps and doing app reviews and saying there's different problems with apps. And even Twitter's not very accessible, and there's lots of apps that can really help the blind and visually impaired community, but it's not accessible because the teams developing these applications are not diverse enough.
And on you're 1,000% correct. And on top of what you said, which is correct, the other problem is that when they're developing these technologies, they are not, when you develop a technology, if you want it to be accessible for blind people, you have to do that first. You have to decide that it's going to be accessible and then build it. You can't build it and then wish it was accessible. And that's what we have. We have these companies that are doing great things, that are building great technology that is becoming easier and easier over time to use, but still we have very few companies that are building apps and technology with the intent to be accessible for blind people before anything else. And that's really that's what it is, and that's what you're noticing. Yeah.
Another thing that I think about is that my main reason and my main focus on diversity is diversity of experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the blind and visually impaired community experiencing the world in a completely different way than I experience it. And in a lot of areas is much more enhanced than I experience it in. And there's so much to contribute to communities and applications and technologies. And I think typically teams, and maybe this is an unconscious bias, maybe it's trained, I'm not too sure, but I think there is a school of thought there that the blind and visually impaired community, because they're part of that community, they cannot develop the features needed for a Twitter, for a Facebook outside of that community.
You're 100%.
I'm almost certain.
100% correct. 100%.
I'm almost certain the blind and visually impaired community will come up with features, the best features that could probably ever be seen for Instagram or for Snapchat, just because of the experiences that the communities have had.
I'm really glad you're on this podcast, because you're bringing up points that have never occurred to me. That's really cool. That's really cool. So you're right. How do we fix it?
I think first, and this is why I'm here. First, it's an awareness thing. Right. And I think it's intimidating. I have grown up my whole life, and I have never had to be a part of the blind and visually impaired community. Never. And for me to learn, I had to go outside and find Facebook groups and try to join those Facebook groups. And if we were, even in here in London, we're still social distancing, so there's not many in-person events. But I would have to attend those in-person events and get to know the community and get to understand. And it's a lot of listening. So even in the Facebook group, I don't really say too much. I'm listening, I'm asking questions, I'm there with an open mind, and it's awareness of other people's experiences. I went through the same journey in the LGBTQ community, and I went to events and joined Facebook groups, and it's a lot of listening, trying to understand, and it is very different, and it can be uncomfortable at times. But if you want to facilitate innovation, if you want to lead teams, it's something you have to do that I don't think we focus on too much. But this is the reason my podcast exists, to explore those things and speak to organizers and see what communities are thinking about problem solving.
What's it called? This podcast?
It's called the Hackathon Podcast.
The Hackathon Podcast. All right, available on Apple, right?
Yep, available on Apple, Spotify, Anchor, almost every streaming platform, I believe.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool. Now we can get, and that's the other fascinating thing, is that it's very easy today for us to share our message with the world. It takes very little effort. So it's really cool. It's really fascinating. But I think that, it's absolutely true that companies are just not building apps around experience. Really what they build apps on is profit. It's all about profit. It's all about the dollar. or the, just trying to make